She left my plane ticket at home, by accident, but what I put in her luggage made her regret everything. I never thought my lifelong dream of visiting Paris would end with me sitting alone at JFK Airport, watching my daughter-in-law shrug and say, "Oh no, your ticket's not here. I must have left it on the counter." She said it so smoothly, so rehearsed, that it didn't even sound like a mistake. She glanced at my son, my only child, who just stared at the floor. They were boarding the plane. And I wasn't. I stood there, 72 years old, passport in hand, a brand new suitcase rolling behind me. I'd spent $25,000 on this trip. A retirement celebration. A promise I made to myself when I was still grading high school essays and cleaning up after other people's children. Someday, I'll see Paris. But apparently, someday didn't include me. Not in Kristen's version of the itinerary. I turned to the airline agent, trying to remain calm. "Can't you just reprint my ticket?" He looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, there's no reservation under your name. Just 2 passengers, Kristen and Daniel." And there it was. The confirmation. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been erased. I glanced back at Kristen. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. She acted like someone who had already rehearsed this scene in her head 100 times, and in every version, I ended up right where I was, out of the picture. I looked at Daniel, hoping for something, an explanation, a defense, even a lie. But he just stood there, silent, like a child hiding behind the hem of someone else's cruelty. I tried to laugh it off, to pretend it was a misunderstanding. "Well, maybe it's a digital mix-up. I'll just buy another ticket." Kristen blinked, slowly. "Eleanor, they're boarding now. We can't wait." She didn't even say, "I'm sorry." I watched as they handed over their passports and disappeared down the jet bridge, Kristen pulling the designer carry-on I had gifted her last Christmas. Daniel wearing the cashmere coat we picked out together, back when he still asked my opinion. No one looked back. And I, Eleanor, retired teacher, loyal mother, invisible woman, sat down on a cold metal bench and realized something I should have understood long ago. This wasn't carelessness. This was strategy. Kristen had spent years painting me as forgetful. Too old, too much. Little comments here and there, about me mixing up names, needing reminders, not remembering things like I used to. She had been laying the groundwork. And this? This was the grand finale. They didn't want me in Paris. They didn't want me at all. So I sat there quietly. Not crying, not panicking, just thinking. If Kristen wanted silence, she'd get it. But it wouldn't be submission. It would be strategy. They left me behind, but the silence they gave me became my strength. Back home, the house was too still. The kind of stillness that doesn't comfort, it accuses. I stood in my kitchen, pouring hot water over a single tea bag, watching the steam curl into the air like a ghost of everything I had planned. 2 mugs sat in the cabinet, untouched. I had imagined sharing a quiet Parisian breakfast with Daniel, maybe Kristen too, if she could bother to look up from her phone. A croissant, a bit of jam, a window view of the Seine. Instead, I stirred sugar into my tea alone. And they were probably sipping champagne on the plane, toasting to a trip funded by the woman they just abandoned. I replayed the scene at the airport like a film on loop. Kristen's, oops. Daniel's silence. The agent's awkward glance. There was no panic in her voice. No apology. Just indifference. It wasn't just that I didn't get on the plane. It was the message, "You don't matter." That realization cut deeper than any lost vacation. I hadn't just been excluded from Paris, I had been excluded from my own family. I thought of all the hours I spent researching the trip, every detail picked with care. The private art tours, the boutique hotel in the Marais, even the same dinner cruise on Daniel's birthday. I wanted to make it special for them. I wanted it to be a memory we could share. But apparently, Kristen had a different memory in mind. One where I didn't exist. I glanced at my phone. Nothing from Daniel. Not a text, not a voicemail. As if I had disappeared the moment they took off. And maybe I had. The part that hurt the most wasn't missing the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre. It was realizing that I was the only one who saw this as a family trip. To them, I was just the funding. The bank behind the dream. A few days earlier, Kristen had thanked me in passing while scrolling through her phone. "You're so generous, Eleanor," she'd said, without even looking at me. "We really appreciate it." "Appreciate it," she said. "Not you." And that, I think, was the difference. They wanted the perks of having me around. But not the presence. Not the person. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the heat sting my throat. For years, I've told myself it was enough to be useful. That being needed was the same as being loved. But this silence? This empty kitchen, this hollow space where connection should have been? It told me the truth. I'd been used. Not invited. Not remembered. Just tolerated when convenient. And the worst part? I had let it happen. But not anymore. I wasn't sure what came next, but something had shifted. Kristen may have taken Paris from me. But she didn't know me as well as she thought. I wasn't confused. I wasn't fragile. I was waking up. And Kristen? She'd find that out soon enough. Her cruelty at the airport wasn't new. I just hadn't connected the dots, until now. That night, I couldn't sleep. I ended up in my bedroom with a cup of chamomile tea and the old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. It started as a distraction. Something gentle to counter the sharpness of Kristen's betrayal. But as I flipped through page after page, birthdays, holidays, graduations, a new kind of pain surfaced. The kind that hides behind smiles in photos. Kristen was always there in the background. Always smiling. Always polished. But I remembered what the pictures couldn't show. Like that Christmas 3 years ago when I bought the grandkids matching sweaters and accidentally switched the gift tags. Kristen laughed too loudly. "Oh, Eleanor," she said in front of everyone, "maybe next year we label things in larger print?" I laughed too, nervously. But I felt the sting. The implication. That I was losing it. Or the family barbecue last summer. I was telling a story about Daniel's first school play, and halfway through, Kristen cut in with, "That never happened, Eleanor. You must be confusing it with something else." Daniel didn't say a word. I started to doubt myself after that. It was subtle at first. The way she'd correct me in front of others. The long pauses after I spoke. The way she'd repeat my stories as if to clarify them. Little things. Like removing me from the family group chat and then saying, "Oh, you must have accidentally left it." Or planning outings with the grandkids and telling me afterward, "We didn't think you'd be up for it." I had begun to question if I was, in fact, slipping. But now, with the airport incident fresh in my mind, everything clicked into place. She wasn't being helpful. She was editing me out, piece by piece. And Daniel? He went along with it. Maybe it was easier for him. Maybe he believed her. Or maybe he was just tired of choosing sides. I looked down at the page in my lap, Daniel, 10 years old, hugging me with both arms, his cheeks smeared with chocolate cake. A birthday party I planned. A cake I baked. A boy who once thought I was the safest place in the world. When did that change? Maybe it didn't happen all at once. Maybe it was a slow unraveling. One comment here, one shrug there. Kristen planting seeds of doubt, and me, watering them with silence. And now, here I was. Not just left behind at the airport. Left behind in my own family. I reached for the last photo in the album, a picture of the 3 of us. Me, Daniel, and Kristen on the day they got engaged. I had hosted a small celebration. The champagne glasses in our hands were gifts from my wedding set. Kristen was wearing the pearl earrings I had given her. And I remembered what she said that day when I complimented her dress. "Oh, it's just something simple." I didn't want to outshine anyone. But she always had. And maybe that was the point all along. It took a friend to say what I was afraid to admit. This wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. 2 days after they left, I met my friend Martha for coffee at the little cafe behind St. Cecilia's Church. We always sit at the corner table near the stained glass. It's quiet there, sacred in a way. She didn't ask how Paris was. She just took one look at my face and said, "Something's happened." I told her everything. The airport, the missing ticket, Kristen's calm indifference, Daniel's silence, and the way I had to take a cab home from JFK like a stray dog no one wanted to claim. Martha didn't interrupt. She just stirred her coffee slowly, lips pressed into a firm line. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Eleanor, they didn't forget you. They removed you." Her voice wasn't cruel, it was clear. And in that moment, clarity felt like mercy. "Kristen's done this before," Martha continued. "Remember my niece's baby shower? Kristen left her own mother off the guest list. Said she lost the address. It wasn't an accident." I blinked. I hadn't heard that story. Martha's niece, like me, had once believed Kristen's stories. The sweet tone, the helpless shrug, the perfect makeup hiding sharp edges. She's not disorganized, Eleanor, Martha said. She's calculating. I let that sink in. Kristen had taken my Paris dream and turned it into a silent exile. But maybe it wasn't just about this trip. Maybe it was part of something bigger. A slow, deliberate push out of my son's life. Why would she do that? I asked, already knowing the answer. Martha didn't flinch. Because it's easier to control Daniel when you're not around. You're his anchor, his history, and she doesn't like anyone reminding him of who he used to be. That hit me like a wave I hadn't seen coming. I sipped my tea, the taste suddenly bitter. I remembered Kristen's comments, little things said over the years. Daniel's so mature now, she'd once said. It's amazing how much he's grown since moving away from your influence. At the time, I thought she meant it kindly. Now I wasn't so sure. Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. This wasn't about Paris, Eleanor. This was about control. Erasing you from their life, gracefully. With plausible deniability. She's good at that, I murmured. She's practiced, Martha corrected. I sat there, staring at the delicate swirls of foam in my cup. I had wanted to believe it was a mistake. That somehow, the ticket really had been forgotten. That Daniel just didn't know. But no, he knew. They both did. I wasn't confused. I wasn't forgetful. I was inconvenient. And Kristen had decided it was time to phase me out. But here's the thing she didn't count on. I may be 72. I may be polite, but I'm not soft. And I'm not done. Not by a long shot. They thought I'd be too polite to look. But curiosity has a way of opening doors and uncovering truths. A few days before their flight, Kristen and Daniel had dropped off some of their luggage at my house. Just so it's out of the way, Kristen had said, carefully placing her designer tote and an expensive-looking carry-on in the guest room closet. After they left me at the airport, I avoided that room. I couldn't bear to look at their things. Reminders of what I paid for, reminders of where I should have been. But that morning, I woke up with a different feeling. Not grief, not anger, curiosity. That kind of curiosity women like me aren't supposed to have anymore. The kind we were taught to suppress, in favor of being respectable. Well, Kristen had already taken my dignity for a walk through the terminal. I figured I might as well follow my instincts. I opened the guest room door. The light filtered in through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the floor. Her tote bag sat there, half-zipped. I hesitated. Then I reached in. I found a makeup pouch. A silk scarf. A glossy Paris guidebook. And then, at the bottom, a manila folder. I pulled it out, hands steady. Inside, printed itineraries. The originals. Mine was there. My full name. My passport number. Hotel confirmations. Tour schedules. It was all there. But my name was crossed out. With a pen. A fine black stroke through every mention of Eleanor Martin. In the margin, someone, Kristen, I knew her handwriting, had written, adjusted for 2 packs. 2 passengers. There were sticky notes, too. One said, reschedule wine tasting. Eleanor would have hated that. Another, no need for extra car service. I sat on the bed, my breath shallow. This wasn't a last-minute error. It was a rehearsal. She had gone through the effort of removing me on paper before removing me in person. It wasn't a forgotten ticket. It was a blueprint. I didn't cry. That's the strange thing. I just sat there, feeling the kind of calm that comes after you've stopped denying the obvious. She had planned to erase me from the trip. From the photos. From the memories. And maybe, eventually, from the family. I put everything back exactly where I found it. Every sticky note. Every printout. I zipped the bag carefully and left the room. Because now I knew. And more importantly, she didn't know I knew. That was power. She thought she was in control. That I would sit in silence and stew in confusion. That I'd second-guess myself, maybe even apologize. But no, I wasn't confused anymore. She was trying to write me out of the story. She forgot one thing. I taught English for 40 years. I know a thing or two about editing. And about writing a twist ending. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. But clarity has a way of becoming something stronger. The next morning, I walked into the public library like I used to when I needed a quiet place to grade papers or escape teenage chaos. Only this time, I wasn't looking for poetry or lesson plans. I headed straight to the legal self-help section. The woman at the desk, a kind-eyed librarian named Janelle, asked if I needed help finding something. Just looking for information on travel fraud and inheritance issues, I said, forcing a casual tone. She didn't flinch. She just nodded and pointed me to the corner by the windows. It's all there. Take your time. And I did. I sat down with 3 books and a notepad. I learned more in 2 hours than I had in the last 2 years. About manipulation. About emotional elder abuse. About how certain behaviors, subtle, constant, demeaning, aren't just cruel. They're patterns. They're tactics. They're documented. Kristen hadn't made a mistake at the airport. She'd made a move, and I, foolishly, had walked right into it. But now I was done playing defense. I started writing things down. Not just what happened in Paris, or rather, what didn't happen, but everything. Every moment where she'd tried to humiliate me. Every time Daniel looked away instead of standing up. There was the time Kristen told the grandkids I couldn't babysit because grandma gets tired too fast. The time she told me to stay seated at Thanksgiving so I wouldn't drop anything. The time she reminded me to double-check your pills when I said I had a headache. Each instance alone felt small. But lined up? It was a campaign. She was building a case, one where I looked forgetful, fragile, unfit. And for what? So that when the day came to push me out of family decisions, nobody would be surprised. Oh, poor Eleanor, they'd say. She's just not herself anymore. But I was still myself. I was sharper than ever. And I had receipts now. Literal ones. I started organizing my finances, too. Printed out bank statements. Marked every travel payment, every gift, every check I wrote to Daniel and Kristen in the last 5 years. The numbers told a story. Eleanor the bank, Eleanor the babysitter, Eleanor the backup plan. But never Eleanor the person. I made a second notebook. Labeled it, "If anything happens to me." I wasn't being dramatic. I was being thorough. I made copies. I left instructions. Just in case. Because the truth is, Kristen didn't just want me quiet. She wanted me irrelevant. And irrelevance is one step away from being erased. But now I had a plan. No more silence. No more guessing. If they wanted to play chess, I was done pretending we were playing checkers. And just like in my classroom days, I was assigning myself a little homework. Learn the game. Study the players. Change the rules. If she wanted to rewrite history, I was going to remind her of the draft she forgot I had. Before they returned from Paris, I made one final decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to come home and pretend nothing had happened. I wasn't going to stand in my own hallway listening to Kristen say, "We missed you," while Daniel offered that sheepish, useless half-smile he'd perfected over the years. No, this time, I would go first. They had left one of Kristen's smaller suitcases in my guest room, one she'd planned to repack before heading back to their house. It was still there, untouched. So I slipped something into it. It was an old letter. A printed one. From Daniel, written 5 years ago when he and Kristen were newly married. Back when he still confided in me. I had kept it tucked inside a book, forgotten for years until this week brought it back to mind. In it, Daniel had written, "Sometimes I feel like Kristen doesn't like how close I am with you. She says it's unhealthy for a man to depend on his mother. But you've always been my constant. I don't want to lose that." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even meant to be a confrontation. Just a moment of truth from a younger version of my son, a version I miss every day. I printed it and placed it gently between 2 sweaters in Kristen's suitcase. No note, no explanation, just the truth, folded quietly into the lining of her designer wardrobe. If she opened it in Paris, it would be too late to do anything about it. And if she waited until she got home, well, either way, it would land like a stone in still water. Because that letter is a reminder. Daniel didn't always think the way he thinks now. And deep down, I suspect he still doesn't. Kristen can twist his memory. She can whisper in his ear. She can plan trips without me, dinners without me, a future without me. But she can't erase the past. Not all of it. I don't know what she'll do when she finds that letter. Maybe she'll tear it up. Maybe she'll show it to him and try to spin it into some paranoid fantasy about me, going through their things. Let her. Because if Daniel reads it, really reads it, he'll remember who he was before her narratives became law. And maybe, just maybe, he'll remember me. The real me. The mother who didn't raise her voice when hurt. The woman who gave without asking. The one who only wanted to be included, not exalted. I zipped the suitcase shut and returned it to the closet. Then I sat down, made a cup of tea, and waited. Not for revenge, for clarity, because Kristen may have tried to edit me out. But I had just added a footnote she'll never forget. She didn't just leave me behind. She rewrote the story before I could even speak. I only called once. Just once. The day after I placed that letter in Kristen's suitcase, I picked up the phone and dialed Daniel. My fingers hesitated on the final number. I didn't know what I'd say, I just knew I couldn't sit in the silence any longer. He didn't answer. Instead, my call went straight to voicemail. His voice, once so familiar, now sounded distant. Programmed. "Hey, it's Daniel. Leave a message." I didn't. I hung up and stared at the wall. I was about to put the phone down when a text buzzed through. My granddaughter. 12 years old. Sweet, sensitive. She calls me, Nana E. Her message was short. "Mom says you canceled your ticket on purpose. She said you made a scene." The words hit harder than I expected. Kristen had already told them a version of events where I was the villain. Before the wheels of their plane even touched down, she'd started her campaign. Spinning the story so that my absence looked like a tantrum, not a betrayal. I felt dizzy. Cancelled my own ticket? I couldn't even access the booking. She'd insisted on handling all the arrangements. "It's easier if I do it all together," she said. I remember that clearly. She didn't want me accidentally booking the wrong days. And now she was using that control to rewrite history. To the outside world, I was just a bitter old woman trying to ruin their vacation. A jealous mother-in-law. A drama queen. Daniel must have believed it, at least partly. Otherwise, he would have called. He would have asked, "Mom, what happened?" But he didn't. He accepted the story she fed him. The one where I was unstable. Overreacting. Embarrassing. And the sad thing? It wasn't even the first time. This had been Kristen's quiet talent for years, reframing reality. A wrong look becomes an accusation. A forgotten gift becomes proof I don't care. A moment of confusion becomes evidence that I'm slipping. And now? Being left behind in New York had become a self-inflicted wound, in her version, at least. I wanted to scream, to call Daniel again and beg him to listen. To explain, to plead, but I didn't, because I've learned something about pleading. The moment you have to beg someone to believe you, they've already chosen not to. So instead, I took out my notebook. The one I started in the library. And I wrote down exactly what happened. Every detail, every word Kristen said, every receipt, every text, every instance of manipulation, a timeline. It wasn't for the courts. Not yet. It wasn't for the family. Not yet. It was for me. Because when people try to gaslight you into questioning your own memories, you need to anchor yourself in the truth. Kristen wanted control of the narrative. Well, I had a pen too. And I had just started writing. They left me out, but I remembered who I was before they made me feel small. That Friday, I went out for lunch with some of my old colleagues. We hadn't all been together in over a year, not since the last retirement party. But when I sent a group text asking if anyone was free, 5 of them responded within 10 minutes. Apparently, I wasn't as alone as I thought. We met at a small Italian place we used to go to after staff meetings. I walked in first, wearing my favorite navy coat and the lipstick Kristen once said was too bold for your age. Good. Marta was already there, waving from the booth. "Eleanor," she said like she always did, with warmth and surprise, as if she still couldn't believe I had retired before she did. The rest trickled in. Diane with her floral scarf, Linda with her stories about her garden, and Claire, who never stopped grading essays even though she didn't teach anymore. We ordered too much food, laughed too loud, and stayed longer than the lunch rush allowed. At one point, Marta raised her glass of iced tea and said, "You always held your head high, even when kids were cruel. You taught me that." I smiled, but something inside me cracked. Because I hadn't held my head high at the airport. I hadn't even spoken up. I let them walk away. But sitting at that table, I realized something. I hadn't disappeared. Kristen hadn't erased me. She had just convinced me to shrink. And I had let her. She made me feel like an inconvenience. Like an embarrassing relic to keep tucked away until needed for childcare or holidays. But my friends? These women who had known me through divorces, job changes, family losses, they saw me. I was still Eleanor. Not Nana E., not the mother-in-law, not the problem. Just me. I told them a little about Paris. Just the basics. They left without me, I said simply, stirring my soup. There was a pause. No one asked for details. They didn't need to. Claire looked at me over her glasses. Sometimes, she said, people forget what you've done for them. But it doesn't mean you forget who you are. It struck me harder than I expected. Because that's exactly what I'd been doing these last few years, forgetting myself. Little by little, I'd allowed Kristen's passive-aggressive comments to chip away at my confidence. I'd accepted Daniel's silence as normal. I'd tolerated being left out, overlooked, and dismissed. But I wasn't fragile. I was just tired of being careful. So I stopped being careful. I laughed louder. I ordered dessert. I showed Marta pictures of a hotel in Montreal I'd been considering for a solo trip. Just for me. You're going? She asked, eyes wide. Maybe, I said, smiling. I've always wanted to see Quebec in the fall. It wasn't Paris, but it didn't have to be. It would be mine. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. I didn't raise my voice. I just wrote the truth, and watched it rise to the top. It started with a simple click. After lunch with the girls, I went home and looked up the hotel they were staying at in Paris. The one I had booked, paid for, and dreamed about. I had researched that place for weeks. Quiet street, view of the Seine, breakfast included. It was going to be a memory for the three of us. And then, it wasn't. I found it on a travel site, 5 stars, glowing reviews. Photos of the exact suite I'd chosen. My suite. The one Kristen upgraded to, as a surprise. I bet she didn't mention who paid for it. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without thinking twice, I wrote a review. I didn't use my full name, just initials. I didn't rant. I didn't accuse. I didn't even mention Kristen by name. I simply wrote the truth. I booked this hotel for a family trip to Paris. Paid in full. Planned every detail. Unfortunately, I was left behind at the airport due to a forgotten ticket, mine. The same ticket I paid for. The staff may recall 2 guests checking in, but it was meant to be 3. I hope they enjoyed the suite I never got to see. No threats. No anger. Just facts. It posted instantly. I didn't think anyone would notice. The next morning, it was the top-rated review. I checked it again after breakfast. 23 people had marked it as helpful. A few had commented, strangers, offering sympathy. One woman wrote, "This is heartbreaking. Thank you for sharing. Hope you get your Paris someday." Another said, "You deserved better." Shame on them. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in this whole mess, my voice had been heard, loud and clear, without shouting. Kristen thinks reputation is everything. She curates every detail of her life like a brand. The perfect family. The perfect vacation. The perfect mother-in-law, who's just a bit too much to handle. But now, there was a wrinkle in her image. A truth she couldn't control. A review she couldn't delete. And the best part? I hadn't said anything that wasn't true. It wasn't revenge. It was documentation. And something tells me she'd see it. She checks those things. Probably twice a day. She wanted to make me look forgetful. Fragile. Out of touch. Instead, I'd reminded the world that I wasn't silent, just patient. And I was done being patient. Let her scramble. Let her try to spin it. The internet doesn't forget. And neither do I. She thought she'd control the story. But now, the script was slipping, and her voice said it all. It was early, just after 6. I was outside, tending my roses. The morning air was still cool, the kind that wraps gently around your skin and clears the clutter from your thoughts. My hands were in the soil, trimming away the dead petals, when I heard the soft buzz of my phone on the porch table. I glanced over. Kristen. I didn't answer. Instead, I let it ring out. She left a voicemail. I waited. Tended one more rose. Then, calmly, I picked up the phone and pressed play. Her voice came through shaky. Not the polished, unbothered Kristen I was used to. This Kristen sounded off balance. Eleanor? I don't know what that letter was, or how it got into my suitcase. But Daniel saw it. And he's furious. He keeps asking me questions I can't answer. What are you trying to do? She paused. Then her voice lowered, defensive, tight. You and I both know it's your word against mine. And you don't want to start something you can't finish. There it was. A threat wrapped in a whisper. But she was wrong. It wasn't my word against hers anymore. It was her handwriting, in the margins of the itinerary. It was Daniel's words, in the letter he forgot he once wrote. It was her patterns, her edits, her strategy, finally exposed. I didn't need to respond. She was unraveling all on her own. I looked out at the garden. Sunlight was breaking through the trees now, catching on the petals of my favorite rosebush, the one Daniel planted with me when he was 13. He named it Juliet after reading Romeo and Juliet in school. Back when he still called me after every test and asked me to read over his essays. He used to trust me. And now, he was beginning to question the one who taught him not to. Good. I hope that letter burned a hole in her pocket all through Paris. I hope every quiet moment was haunted by the possibility that I knew more than I ever let on. Because I do. And now, so does she. Kristen always thrived on control, narratives, perceptions, appearances. But control is only power when no one's watching. Well, I was watching now. I saved the voicemail, downloaded it, transcribed it, added it to the file I had started in the library, my evidence, my truth. If she wanted to play games, she'd learn what it feels like to play against a woman with nothing left to lose but her patience. The roses looked beautiful that morning. So did I. They wanted my money. I gave it a new purpose. One they can never touch. 2 days after Kristen's voicemail, I sat in a walnut-paneled office, across from a man in wire-rimmed glasses and a sharp navy suit. "Let's update the will," I said, sliding my notebook across his desk. He glanced at the neatly organized pages, timelines, receipts, call logs, printed messages. He raised his eyebrows. "I take it this isn't a routine revision." "No," I said softly. "It's a liberation." His name was Marcus, and he had handled my late husband's estate after the accident. Reliable, discreet, and, more importantly, he listened without condescension. I told him everything, not just the Paris incident, but the patterns. The lies. The shifting narrative Kristen had been building for years. The way Daniel, my sweet boy, had learned to look through me instead of at me. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded. When I told him about the letter I'd slipped into her suitcase, he actually smiled. "You still know how to play a long game," he said. I nodded. Now it's time to finish it. Together, we rewrote my will. Daniel and Kristen were removed, completely. In their place, I established a travel scholarship for underprivileged girls in public schools. I called it, the Eleanor Dream Fund. Because once, I dreamed of Paris. And even though I didn't get there, someone else will. We also placed my assets in a trust, locked down, untouchable, airtight. Kristen could spin whatever tale she liked. There would be no inheritance to fight over. I kept my home, my accounts, my garden. But I also added a clause. Any attempt to challenge the will would immediately disqualify the challenger. Irrevocably. Marcus read it over, whistled low. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure. Because here's the thing. I didn't do this out of spite. I did it out of clarity. They made it clear I wasn't family, I was funding. They made it clear I wasn't loved, I was leverage. So I made my own clarity. They didn't want me in their lives. Now they're not in mine." When I left the office, it was raining lightly, but I didn't rush. I let the drops fall on my coat and my cheeks. Not cold, not heavy, just clean. I walked down the street and past a travel agency with postcards taped to the window. One caught my eye, Montreal in autumn. Gold leaves, a quiet river, cobblestone streets. Not Paris, but maybe better, because this time, it would be mine. And when I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted, quietly, alone. Not to revenge, to release. They had stolen Paris from me. But I still had a future. And they? They had no idea what was waiting for them in that suitcase. They smiled like nothing happened. But when she saw what I'd left behind, her smile shattered. They returned on a Tuesday. I heard their car door slam before I saw them. Kristen's stilettos clicking up the walkway like punctuation marks. Daniel trailing behind with his suitcase and that same tired expression he's worn since he learned to tune me out. They rang the bell like guests. I didn't rush. When I finally opened the door, Kristen beamed like we were long-lost friends. "Eleanor," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "We brought you something from Paris." As if Paris had happened to me at all. I didn't say a word. Just stepped aside and let them in. Daniel gave me a small, sheepish hug. "Hey, Mom," he said, quieter. "You look well." I nodded. "You too." They acted as though nothing had happened. As though they hadn't left me behind like forgotten luggage. As though I hadn't seen the itinerary. As though Kristen hadn't already rewritten the story. But I had time on my side. Your other bag is still in the guest room, I said to Kristen, casually. The one you left behind. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway. Oh, right, yes. Thank you. She moved quickly, like she didn't want me following. But I did. I stood in the doorway as she unzipped the suitcase. Her hands moved fast, almost frantic, pulling out sweaters and scarves until she saw it, the folded letter. She froze. For a split second, I saw it all. Her pupils narrowed. Her throat bobbed with a swallow. One hand hovered above the paper like it might bite. She picked it up, opened it, read the first line. And that was it. Her mask cracked. Her whole face shifted, tightened, paled, then flared red with something halfway between fear and fury. She knew what it was. She knew who wrote it. She knew I had kept it. And that I had chosen now, of all moments, to return it. Daniel entered the room behind her, oblivious. Hey, what's taking? He stopped when he saw her holding the paper. What's that? Kristen quickly shoved it into the bottom of the suitcase. Nothing, just old notes. But Daniel wasn't stupid. He saw the handwriting. His own. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the guest room, with her lies, my letter, and the version of Daniel she'd tried so hard to erase. That suitcase wasn't just full of Paris clothes. Now, it held a piece of history. And she couldn't spin her way out of it. Because no matter how carefully she curated the present, the past still has receipts. She thought she controlled the story, until I showed her the parts she forgot to edit. They joined me in the living room, sitting across from me like two people who believed their lies could still hold. Kristen was holding her teacup too tightly. Daniel sat stiff, like he knew something was coming but didn't have the strength to stop it. Good, because I was done pretending. I looked them both in the eye and said, calmly, I know what you did. Kristen tilted her head, the way she always does when she wants to seem innocent. Eleanor, if this is about Paris, I've already explained. No, I interrupted. This isn't about Paris. This is about you crossing out my name from the itinerary you kept in your tote bag. This is about the sticky notes where you planned around me. This is about the lie you told my granddaughter, that I cancelled my own ticket. That I made a scene. Daniel flinched. I turned to him. You were there, Daniel. You watched me stand at that gate. You heard what the agent said. And you said nothing. He didn't meet my eyes. Kristen scoffed, setting down her cup. This is ridiculous. You're taking things completely out of context. Maybe you saw something and misunderstood. No, I said. And I smiled, just a little. I also saw the letter. The one Daniel wrote me 5 years ago. The one I left in your suitcase. The silence in the room turned sharp. Daniel blinked. Wait, what letter? Kristen looked like she wanted to sink into the couch. You remember, don't you? I said gently. You wrote it back when things were simpler. Before all the adjusting. Daniel looked at Kristen. You found that letter? Kristen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I thought it was something old. It didn't seem important. I laughed. A soft, tired laugh. It was important enough for you to hide it. Daniel stood, pacing now. And Kristen? She did what she always did, minimized. You're overreacting, Eleanor, she said. You always do this. You twist things. You make everything about you. I stood too. No, I said quietly. I've been quiet for years. I've let the little slights slide. I ignored the corrections, the jokes, the way you slowly erased me from your version of this family. I looked at Daniel again. I paid for that trip because I thought it would bring us closer. Instead, it showed me exactly where I stand. He didn't speak, but his face said enough. Kristen rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic. But her voice shook. Because she knew. The performance was over. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't crying. I was telling the truth. And for someone like Kristen, that was the most dangerous thing in the room. They erased me from Paris. So I erased them from dinner and read their lines to the whole cast. The invitation went out a week later. Not to Daniel, not to Kristen, to everyone else. My sisters, my nieces, my cousins, my 2 godchildren and their spouses. Everyone Kristen used to parade in front of, pretending we were one big happy family. I told them I wanted to host a dinner. Nothing fancy, I said. Just a little family gathering. They came. All of them. And when they asked about Daniel and Kristen, I smiled and said, they won't be joining us tonight. No one pushed. Not right away. But I saw the curiosity behind their eyes, the questions they were too polite to voice. So after the main course, rosemary chicken and potatoes the way Daniel used to like, I stood up and tapped my glass. I'd like to share something, I said. Then I pulled out the letter. The one Daniel wrote me 5 years ago. I read it aloud. Every word. Sometimes I feel like Kristen doesn't like how close I am with you. She says it's unhealthy for a man to depend on his mother. But you've always been my constant. I don't want to lose that. The room was quiet. Not even forks moved. Then I laid down the itinerary with my name crossed out. The printouts. The receipts. The photo of the Paris suite I paid for but never saw. And finally, the voicemail Kristen had left. When I finished, I looked around the room and said, clearly and without tears, they left me at the airport. Intentionally. And then told the grandchildren I cancelled my own ticket. That I made a scene. There were gasps. Murmurs. Someone whispered, "Are you serious?" I nodded. This is not about one trip. This is about control, manipulation, and me deciding that I am no longer available for either. No one spoke for a long time. Then my niece Carla, always the bold one, said, "You didn't deserve that." I smiled. I know. And I meant it. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to make others comfortable. I wasn't biting my tongue. I wasn't giving Kristen space to rewrite the truth. I was writing my own version, in bold, with citations. And when I sat back down, there was no applause, no outrage. Just something better, respect. I could feel it shift in the room. I wasn't just Eleanor, the nice grandmother, the sweet hostess. I was Eleanor, the woman who stood up for herself. They didn't come to dinner that night. But they were very much on the menu. And now? Everyone knew exactly why they wouldn't be invited again. He finally called. But I wasn't the same woman waiting by the phone. The voicemail came that night, after the dinner. I had just finished loading the dishwasher when I saw the missed call. Daniel. The first time he'd tried to contact me since the moment I exposed everything. I didn't answer. But he left a message. "Hey, Mom. I don't even know where to start. Kristen told me you'd blown things out of proportion, but then I saw the letter. I forgot I even wrote it." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing, like he wasn't sure whether to keep talking or hang up and pretend he hadn't tried. "You always looked out for me. I guess I didn't realize how far things had gone. I'm sorry. I don't know what to believe anymore." I stood there, hands resting on the counter, letting his voice wash over me. It should have comforted me. It didn't. Because the woman he was calling, the mother he hoped would make things right again, was gone. I picked up the phone, pressed save, and poured myself a glass of wine. When I finally called him back the next morning, I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply said, "Daniel, believe who you used to be. Before she turned you into someone I don't recognize." He didn't speak right away. Just that familiar silence. Then he said, "Do you think we can fix this?" I could have said yes. Once upon a time, I would have. But now? I've learned that not all broken things need repairing. Some are meant to be understood, not restored. You'll have to do that with your own conscience, I said gently. Not with me. And that was the truth. I wasn't going to step back into the shadows to make him comfortable again. I wasn't going to undo their choices just because the consequences arrived. He whispered, "Okay," like a man who dropped something precious and only now heard it shatter. And I let him sit in that silence. Because this wasn't punishment. It was honesty. For too long, I had been the soft landing, the default forgiveness. I had made excuses for him the way he made excuses for Kristen. No more. I loved my son. I always would. But love doesn't mean losing yourself. And if Kristen taught me anything, it's that erasure isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Like inaction. Like a son standing still while his mother disappears from the picture. Now, the picture had changed. And Daniel? He'd have to decide what kind of frame he wanted to stand in going forward. They stole Paris. I took back everything else. I boarded the plane to Montreal on a crisp Monday morning, just as the leaves were beginning to blush gold. No family send-off. No awkward hugs. No Kristen managing the itinerary. Just me, a small carry-on, and a journal filled with everything I never got to say, until now. I sat by the window. Always the window. I wanted to see the clouds from above. To be reminded that the world is wider than betrayal. The flight attendant offered wine before takeoff. Yes, please, I said. And smiled. It wasn't Paris, but it was mine. Montreal had been on my list for years, quieter, older, gentler. A city that speaks French, yes, but without the pressure of perfection. A place where I didn't have to perform. Where I could walk cobblestone streets alone and not feel lonely. Where no one would ask, "Are you sure you're okay to travel by yourself?" Because I was. More than okay. I had been told, in 100 small ways, that I was inconvenient. That my memories were flawed. That my presence was too much. Too emotional. Too involved. And for a while, I believed them. But sitting there on that plane, wine in hand, I realized something simple and powerful. I was never too much. I was just too aware. Too aware of the games. Too unwilling to stay silent. Too inconvenient for people who relied on my silence to stay comfortable. Kristen had made the mistake of thinking my kindness meant weakness. She forgot, I'm a teacher. I've stared down teenagers who thought they were invincible. I've rewritten failing essays into final exams. I've stood in front of parents who blamed me for their children's choices and still came back the next morning with a lesson plan and a smile. I know how to survive a storm without making a sound. And I know when to walk away before the flood swallows me. In Montreal, I would visit a museum, sit in a garden, write postcards no one would expect. Not out of spite, but out of joy, real, quiet joy, because I finally understood. They could take the trip. They could take the photos. They could even take the family dinners. But they couldn't take me. And they couldn't take my story. I wrote the final lines in my journal just as the plane leveled in the sky. They thought leaving me behind was the end of something. But really, it was the beginning. Then I closed the journal, sipped my wine, and looked out the window. No Kristen, no Daniel, just clouds, and peace.